let's work in the second quadrant. Let's work in the second quadrant. And as we work in this quadrant, the thing that I share with my students is they'll have to remember an acronym. All students take calculus. All students take calculus. They'll have to remember that. And that's what I ask them to remember to determine the sign of the trig function given the different quadrants. And I'll show you exactly what I mean. Let's take a look. So all students, this is quadrant 2, this is quadrant, I don't know if you can see that, quadrant 3, and this is quadrant 4. All students take calculus. All students take calculus. And what that's going to do, remembering that little expression there, will help you recall what's positive in this quadrant. What's positive in this quadrant? Well, in this quadrant, S is positive. In this third quadrant, T is positive. In this fourth quadrant, C is positive. In this second quadrant, the sine is positive. In this third quadrant, tangent is positive. And in this fourth quadrant, cosine is positive. So, let us proceed. The thing I'd like you to be able to see is we want to find some information about the cosine, sine, and tangent of 120 degrees. Well, for 120 degrees, what you have to do is, the thing that I ask my students to do is don't work with obtuse angles. Like, when I say obtuse, I mean greater than 90. Don't work with obtuse angles like 120. Work with the reference angle. In other words, the angle measured from the x-axis of that obtuse angle. So the reference angle of this is 60. The reference angle of 120 is 60. So rather than take the cosine of 120, you're really going to take the cosine of 60. And the cosine of 60, we've already established as half. And you're not going to take the sine of this 120. You're going to take the sine of the reference angle, again, which is 60. That reference angle is the number of degrees measured against the x-axis. And we've already established that the sine of 60 is radical 3 over 2. And then the tangent of 120, which is the same thing as tangent of 60, is radical 3. All of this we have done already. And what you'll have to remember is that in this quadrant, the only thing that's positive is sine. So this is positive, and the cosine would be negative, and the tangent would be negative. All right? But the sine is positive. The sine, the cosine of 120 degrees is negative half. The sine of 120 degrees is a positive radical 3 over 2. And the tangent of 120 degrees is a negative radical 3. All right? So let's keep going all the way around the circle. Keep going all the way around the circle. So now let's deal with the cosine, sine, and tangent of 135. Cosine, sine, and tangent of 135. Well, don't use that big obtuse angle. Don't do that. Use the reference angle, which is the number of degrees measured against the x-axis, which in this case is 45. And we've already determined that the cosine of 45 was 1 over radical 2. The sine of 45, we've already determined that to be 1 over radical 2. Don't use the tangent of 135. To determine the tangent of 135 by figuring out what is the tangent of the reference angle of 135. So what is the tangent of 45? And we've already determined that that was 1. All right. So basically, I hope what you see is all I'm doing is I'm really using the same terms that I found in that first quadrant for the second quadrant. The only thing that I'm changing is the fact that in this second quadrant, sine is positive. So the sine of 135 is positive. However, the cosine of 135 is negative. The tangent of 135 is negative. The only thing that's positive in this quadrant is the sine and something called the cosecant, but we won't talk about that right now. So don't deal with this 150. Don't deal with 150. use the reference angle of the 150. By reference angle, I mean the angle of this obtuse angle measured against the x-axis. The acute angle measured against the x-axis. And for this particular angle, it's 30. So we've already determined that the cosine of 30 is radical 3 over 2. The sine of 30 is half, and the tangent of 30 is 1 over radical 3. All right? 1 over radical 3. So recall that in this quadrant, sine is positive. So the cosine of 150 is negative. The tangent of 150 is negative, but this sine is positive. All right? So let's do one more before we take a brief break. Let's do one more. And now on the coordinate axis, this would be, if it's a unit circle, this is 1 unit. This point would be 0. Excuse me, this point would be -1, 0. -1, 0. The cosine of 180 degrees, the cosine of 180 is -1. The sine of 180 is 0. And the tangent of 180 is we told you earlier, the tangent, by definition, is sine over cosine. Well, the tangent of 180 is the sine of 180, which is 0, divided by the cosine of 180, which is -1, and that quotient would be 0. All right?